Welcome and thank you for joining tonight's session, which is part of the Childhood Addiction series. Tonight's topic is screens and gaming disorders in children. My name is Dana Harris from the PHN Education team, and I'll be facilitating tonight's session. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land we are meeting on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I have a few things that I would like to let you know. As attendees, your cameras are automatically disabled and your microphones will be muted. If you have any questions or would like to make comments during tonight's presentations, please send these through via the question box and they will be answered at the end of this evening's presentations. An evaluation will come to you directly after this session. We would be very grateful if you would take the time to complete this, as this information is important for us to ensure that these sessions meet your needs and expectations. Participants in this webinar will be able to register for a live interactive echo session, which is a case-based session on screens and gaming disorders in children, which is planned for Tuesday, the 27th of September at 7 p.m. You will receive an automatic email after this evening's event for information and how to register. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers to you. First of all, we have Brad Marshall. Brad Marshall is recognised as one of Australia's leading experts in gaming and other related disorders. As the director and founder of the Screens and Gaming Disorder Clinic, Australia's first established specialty clinic, he is a well-respected presenter and speaker on the topic, frequenting at schools and parent seminars. He is an author of the parent book, The Tech Diet for Child and Teens, which is published in over a dozen countries. We will then have Dr. Wayne Warburton and Dr. Kim Lee. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight, and I'll hand it over to you, Brad, to start this evening's presentations.
Thank you, Dana. I'll just get my screen up here. Okay. So thank you very much, Dana, for asking us to be here this evening. I hope that we can really help the health practitioners that are along for the ride. So I just want to start with how I got here, because how does one in this field end up as an expert? It's a bit of a long story, but essentially about 15 years ago now, I was working at a major hospital in Sydney in a child and adolescent mental health unit. And the first child case of this screens and gaming disorder came through the intake meeting. So this very senior professor was sitting there and I was trying to keep my head down as a green psychologist. And the professor was describing this young man who was stuck on the Harry Potter world. It wasn't even really gaming, it was sort of teaching and whatnot. And no one wanted to see this young man. And finally he stood up and he said, "Brad, you're it." And I said, "What do you mean I'm it? I don't know anything about this." And he said, "Well, you game, don't you?" And I said, "I mean, yeah, from time to time." He said, "Well, therefore you know more about this than anyone else in this room, so you're it." And that's literally how I ended up down this path. So it was not by design or anything like that. It was just purely falling into it. So fast forward 15 years, and I want to talk a bit about my gaming addiction or overuse or disorder. And we should just get, I guess, off the bat here, the term addiction, some people believe that gaming or screens is an addiction. Other people get very upset with us using that term. So for now, we'll use the term disorder because that's the WHO term, or internet gaming disorder. But you'll hear all three of us, I think, use that term sort of interchangeably. So overuse, problematic use, addiction, disorder. You'll also hear us all use gaming, screens, internet, all interchangeably this evening. So my internet addiction or disorder was MSN, the original social media manager here, as well as Super Mario Kart on Nintendo 64. So games have changed a lot in this time, and this is why I'm showing you. So you see a lot of parents that will come in and say, "This is not really an issue. I gamed when I was younger, but this is very different." And we're going to talk tonight about why and the mechanics behind it. So what do? I do a lot of things, as Dana kind of mentioned. I do research with Professor Wayne Warburton. I'm doing a PhD. So Wayne will be talking to you next. It's a bit daunting speaking before my mentor and professor. But anyway, if I get anything wrong, I'm sure he'll give me some notes. But I also run the Screens and Gaming Disorder Clinic. It says there I have a 3 or 6 month wait list. In fact, I've had to close my books. Every time there's an article in the newspaper or anything like that, we get between 50, 60 referrals. Parenting book, talks like this, education, and the joke in my house is that I'm not allowed to run for Parliament. My wife said to me, if I ever come home and tell her I'm going to run for Parliament, she will probably leave me. So I also just want to frame tonight and spend a few minutes here so that we don't jump too far in, and really just acknowledge that there is a whole nother side to this that Wayne and myself and Kim are probably not really going to delve into. So cyber safety is a very important element, but it's something that there's an overlap, but there's also, this is different. So we're looking more at the right-hand side this evening. So the overuse of gaming, phones, gambling, social media, that sort of stuff. But there is a bit of an overlap. So this evening, what you're going to see, just to give you a bit of a layout of what to expect, is for myself there, and a very skinny photo of me, which is fantastic. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction to gaming and apps. I'm going to introduce internet gaming disorder, or the diagnostic terms. I'm going to talk about the psychological underpinnings of gaming and the psychological underpinnings of social media, because quite often they actually meld into one, which is a tricky thing these days for kids. And then I'll talk a bit and just touch on some psychological treatment options and mainly parent management strategies. There you go, parent management strategies. For Professor Warburton, he's going to be talking about the research in the field. He'll do a deep dive into the neuroscience and aggression in gaming and screens, which he is quite famous for internationally. And he'll also give you an update on our Macquarie Uni lab studies, including some of the ones that I'm doing. For Kim there, he's going to be talking about diagnosis in a clinical setting. So Dr. Kim Lee, being a child psychiatrist, is going to give you much more of the diagnostic stuff. And he's going to be talking about common comorbid presentations, screening tools that you might be interested in using if you have time, medication and how that works and what the evidence looks like, and just generally options for GPs, allied health, you know, in referring or in what you should do if they, you know, a young person with IGD or GD walks through your door. Okay. So I guess if we just start off here with a bit of a diagnostic criteria, and I think this is a good place to start. So in 2017, the WHO in the ICD-11 came up with these 3 different criteria that you need within 12 months to classify for what they called gaming disorder. Now, I think that Kim and Wayne will probably agree with me here that, you know, I'm not in love with the term gaming disorder. I think that it should be internet gaming disorder or screens and gaming disorder, because not everyone who has, you know, pathological use just games. But anyway, if we roll with it, you can see the 3 different criteria that you need in a 12-month period. So you need impaired control over gaming, so onset, frequency, duration, termination. You need number 2 is that increased priority over other activities. So kids that give up swimming or sport or other things. And then that continued use despite negative consequences. So the teenagers where things are getting nasty in their house, or they've, you know, poor grades, but they just can't rein it in. Now, the color coding here is to match what the DSM-5 provisional diagnosis is. So I'm not going to go through each one individually, but you can see here there are 7 criteria, and the DSM in 2013, the DSM-5 came out with internet gaming disorder, and it's similar criteria if you see the color coding. So for the blue there, the continuation and the escalation of negative impacts lines up with symptom number 2, 6, 7, and 9 in the DSM. So, you know, whether you're looking at the gaming disorder or the internet gaming disorder criteria, there are some differences in prevalence rates, but for the most part, they have quite a lot of overlap. I should note here, and Wayne probably knows a lot more about this than I do, but the 9 criteria there, and of which you need 5 of the internet gaming disorder, follows quite strictly the gambling disorder, so other behavioral addictions criteria. So let's just frame what we're talking about here in prevalence rates, because quite often people like myself get, I guess, accused of being an alarmist and of saying that, every child's brain is going to melt because of screen use or gaming, and that's not the case. The statistics say that about 80 to 90% of kids have a perfectly normal recreational use with gaming or screens. So, that there may be occasional issues, but it's not clinical in any sense. But 1 to 3% of kids have a clinical, gaming disorder. And in fact, that's replicated around Western countries. If you look at some of the Southeast Asian countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, Korea, they have much higher rates, between 15, 20%. But in Western countries and in Australia, it's 3%. In fact, one of Professor Warburton's studies recently found 2.8% in an Australian population that qualify. Now, we should just take a second here to clarify there are 4 million Australian children of school age in the last census. So you're talking about somewhere around 100,000 kids here. And then if you look at this middle category of hazardous gaming, which is a subclinical version in the WHO terms, it's probably somewhere around 10%, 8 to 10%. So this is hundreds of thousands of kids that have a subclinical version. So if you're here tonight, whether you're seeing the subclinical version or the clinical version, again, that's a big amount of kids, and that's probably why you're here. So what's the first thing that I ask kids when they come into my clinic? And I've been doing this for almost 15 years now. I ask them about what they game. What do you play? What do you use? What social media apps? How does it work? If I don't know, I ask them to whip their phone out and we will go on YouTube and I'll type in gameplay for that game. And the reason is it's so important to engage and understand what it is that they do and why they do it. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm asking, or I'm one of these people that recommends that parents, have to game with their kid to understand it or anything, but you need just a basic understanding of what they are actually doing online. It also proves very helpful so that you don't come across as judgmental. So let me just take you through a super quick crash course in social media and gaming. So this here is Snapchat. If there's anyone who doesn't know what it is, basically it's a messenger that a lot of kids are using these days. You send pictures, and on the right-hand side there, you've got what we call a Snapchat snap map. So it's a GPS tracker of where all your friends are. And you can think about why that may be a little bit problematic if they haven't been invited to a certain party or something like that. Next up here, we have Fortnite. So one of the most recent first-person shooter games. And look, I just want to get it out there. Fortnite is not the axis of all evil that the media make it out to be. It is just the current, game. And in fact, it's probably in decline now, but it's the current game that is successful, I suppose. But you can also see there's videos of other gamers playing, which they call gameplay. And this is really important because quite often parents that come into your clinic or your setting or wherever you are, they'll say, well, I don't let my child game. They don't game, but all they do is watch other people game. And, that's recreational screen use, and really, clinically speaking, it's not that much different to playing itself. So then we have these strategic games like World of Warcraft or League of Legends, where you play in teams of 5 or in a guild, they call it in World of Warcraft. I note there are, World of Warcraft and League of Legends are maybe not as popular these days, but essentially they're very social games and they have social constructs within them as well. And what I mean by that is this screenshot here of a new social media tool or messenger tool called Discord. I suppose it's not all that new, but it became very popular during COVID lockdowns. A lot of teenagers were using it. A lot of teenagers were missing school because they were doing online classes while on Discord. But you can see on the right-hand side, you've got videos of everyone in your chat. You can actually game while you're chatting with all your friends. It's quite immersive. And so it's one of the social media tools that gamers will quite often use. So where to from here? I mean, VR headsets are coming. I speak to people in the technology industry all the time, and you know, I'm told that within a couple of years, it looks like we'll have VR headsets with Wi-Fi capability chips, so kind of like your mobile phone. So theoretically, you could be sitting on a bus next to someone with a VR headset gaming. Of course, the issue with this is that it's quite immersive, and we don't really know what impacts that's going to have on kids' brains. And with that comes the metaverse. So good old Zuckerberg about a year or two ago said that the metaverse was coming, and for anyone who can't quite wrap their head around what that is, you know, that photo there is a metaverse meeting and what it will look like. You put on a VR headset and you can be sitting in a room with other people's avatars. And again, quite immersive. So I'm not anti-technology. And I think, you know, Kim and Wayne will say the same thing. There are some benefits to that, but we really have to question how immersive that is and what the health costs will be, especially to children and teenagers. So to me, it feels a little bit like this whole Matrix red pill, blue pill thing, but maybe that's me just being a bit old school, but we're going down some serious rabbit holes here. So I just want to touch on this young man here because, and this is going to sound a little bit strange here, so just stay with me. He's a professional gamer. He's Australian. His name is James Giesman, and he plays a game called PUBG. So essentially, it's one of these first-person shooter games for anyone who's sort of sitting there going, I don't know what that is. He's a super successful guy, and he's really impressive. When I go to schools and I talk to students, I play an excerpt of an interview from him talking about how much money he's won and how much money he makes on Twitch, which is a streaming service for gamers where you get subscribers. And so he makes money on Twitch. He makes about $15,000 a month, which is a lot of money just from Twitch, just from streaming. But then he also made about $1 million winning this tournament here, this PUBG tournament with his mates. Now, he's a professional gamer, and the reason I show kids that is because the second half of his interview, he actually says that he doesn't believe that kids should give up school or give up social face-to-face interaction or sport in order to pursue gaming, despite him being a professional. He also warns that you need to get into university and focus on your studies first, if that's your path. And you also need to make sure that you understand that there is a high burnout rate in professional gaming. And he says he sees it every day. So I showed parents this as well, because what we have to understand is if you say to a young person in your clinic or in your setting or your hospital that there's no way you can be a pro, that that's a laughable thing, whether it's a YouTuber or a gamer or a social media influencer, if you say that, that's kind of like you saying, you know, to me when I was young, that you can't be a professional footballer. Now, the fact is I would never be a professional footballer because I'm not athletic enough, but no adult would ever actually say that to 10-year-old Brad, right? So we can be thinking that, but don't pass judgment and try to be open-minded. This is a super busy slide. Don't worry, I don't want you to read it all. I just want you to take note of the stuff on the right-hand side. The reason I'm showing you this is the revenue of the gaming industry in the last 30 or 40 years, and it has continued to go up. And the two main points here are the revenue for the gaming industry is estimated to be $168 billion. So what you also need to understand is that every time some version of gaming starts to dwindle, like arcade or consoles or PCs, they reinvent themselves. So mobile smartphone gaming has just exploded. And this is really important because while we're all scrapping to get money to do research, and Wayne will be more frustrated about this than I am, but you know, we can't possibly get any money to do any research in this field. We've been knocked back, or Wayne's been knocked back multiple times, yet the gaming industry can do as much research and development as they need to because their profits are enormous. Even so much so that the companies on the left-hand side there, Sony, Tencent, Google, Meta, Apple, these are traditional social media companies. They have all been in decline, and they've been buying up gaming labs. So Microsoft just paid $68 billion for this gaming lab. So that's kind of like Netflix buying a film studio for $60 billion, right? So this gaming lab, Activision and Blizzard, they're responsible for some of these games, Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, some big games, but they paid almost $70 billion for one gaming lab. So this shows you that when places like Meta, companies like Meta and Google and Apple and Microsoft are buying into gaming, they must know something here. They know this is a profitable path in future. Okay. So I just want to touch on now the psychological science or the underpinnings, some of them, not all of them, that drive gaming. So the first one is this idea called the Bartell Taxonomy. So Richard Bartell was this guy in the 1990s who came up with this idea that if you can tick a game where it has all four of these things, then you're on to a winner. So for me, when I was playing Mario Kart on Nintendo 64, I was a socialite. I had no reason to play that game unless my mates were sitting around with me playing, right? But let's take that idea of Fortnite, so a first-person shooter game. For the killers, you can literally go into Fortnite. For anyone who doesn't know how it works, there's 100 people that are parachuted into like a Hunger Games scenario here, and it's last man standing or woman standing. And essentially, for the killers, you can go in there and you can just shoot people if that's what drives you. For the achievers, you've got the leaderboard. You want to try and come first or top 10 and climb the ranks within it. For the socialites, you get on there, you can play in teams or duos, you can play in tournaments, and you're just chatting with your friends via video and everything. That's the social aspect. And for the explorers, every month or two, they come up with a new battle pass that you have to pay for, and it's a new map. You know, I was speaking to a kid a few months ago when a new battle pass came out, and he said, "Have you seen the new Fortnite battle pass?" And I'm like, "Oh man, I haven't seen it, but what's so exciting about it?" And he said, "Oh, you can ride a dolphin now, you know?" So for the explorers, there's new maps, there's new worlds, there's new items, but there's something for everyone. So the Bartell Taxonomy has something for everyone, and this is from the 1990s, so games have been doing this for a long time. This is Game Developer 101, by the way. The next part of psych science or the underpinnings here for gaming is this idea of flow. And so this idea that you need to incrementally make a game harder and harder. If you just make it too hard, then people get anxious and they don't want to play anymore. If you make it too easy, then they get bored. So think about a game like even Tetris back in the day, right? Everyone's played Tetris, I imagine. It gets quicker and quicker, and they try to get you in this area of flow. Now, modern games do this far better. Social media apps can do this as well, but modern gaming will get you in an idea of flow. Once you're in flow, it's associated with a distortion of time. So what that means is that's a child or a teenager who agreed to just play one game, and then their parents come home and they get so angry because they haven't gotten off after half an hour or an hour, just because they're stuck in that idea of flow. The next one is called the fun failure effect or the near miss effect. And essentially what that is it's this idea that you can get so close to achieving something and you fall just short. But lights and sound and everything else goes off and you feel like you've won. And of course, we know this is very similar to poker machines. So the fun failure effect, you know, is a similar algorithm that's in many poker machines where they make it go king, king, king. Oh, it's queen. I was so close, but I fell just short. But you still feel like you won. And dopamine goes off, so you play again. Now, I just mentioned dopamine, and this is a very important part here. And we could go on about this for a while, but there's one key, for me, study. It's a 2013 study. Naughty me, I haven't put it the reference there, but it's by a professor in Scandinavia called Katziari. Anyone who wants it can email me. But essentially, in 2013, what Katziari and his colleagues found is that when you give offline gaming, so when you do a functional MRI scan of a brain and you have offline gaming, there is a small amount of dopamine to the brain. When you do online gaming, there's a much bigger dopamine effect. And that's probably because of the social element of it. And it makes sense if you think about it. That's why gaming in the 90s, like I did, you know, there's a little bit of dopamine there, but really to be social, I had to have my mates next to me. But that's changed now with the technology advancing. So much more dopamine to the brain when it's Wi-Fi enabled. Now, that doesn't matter whether that's your best mate from next door or some bloke in the United States. It's much more dopamine to the brain when it's social and it's online gaming. So let's shift to social media and the underpinnings of social media. So the first one is something called the hyper-personal effect. So the idea that anything that's said online is just so much more powerful than what's said in person. And of course, social media apps play on this through likes and comments and all the rest of it as well. And that's all been, you know, well established here. But essentially, for kids, you know, if you think about it, something that's said in the playground in person has less impact than something that is said on an app. And so we have this great debate right now in schools about whether we should have technology or phones in schools. And you know, I'm not afraid to say I don't think there's any reason for phones to be in schoolyards. But anyway, the hyper-personal effect is something that's at play there, as is the Zeigarnik effect. So it's this idea that as humans, we like a logical conclusion, especially to social interactions, right? So we crave that logical conclusion. And let's think about how the social media apps have played on that. In the last couple of years, or maybe 4 or 5 years ago, you certainly would have noticed most apps these days and phones allow you to see when something has been sent and when it's been read, when it's been delivered. And again, that plays on the Zeigarnik effect, because what happens is kids will have their phone out of their room. They know they're supposed to, but they'll sneak out to the kitchen and they'll grab it, and they'll just, you know, mum and dad will come in the morning and it's in their bed, and mum and dad will hit the roof and get so angry about this because the Zeigarnik effect has hit that kid. They just have to know what the loop is in that conversation. And of course, the loops never end. These massive messenger groups or conversations or social media, they don't end. There's no meaningful end to these things. It just jumps to something else. And then, of course, you've got the social comparison theory, which is this idea that we measure our successes and failures based on others. And again, this is quite a famous Instagram model of many years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago now. She came out and said, you know, look, the photo on the left is not real life. You know, it's makeup, it's lighting, it's all this other stuff, you know, it's 60 takes. But the one on the right is real life. And she was one of the first brave people to come out and admit that. So this impacts all of us, right? Because if you have a child that comes in and they're complaining to their parents and it gets quite argumentative, you know, this is a crap holiday because we're at Nelson's Bay, right? Beautiful part of the world, by the way. But we're at Nelson's Bay and all my friends are online. They're in Fiji and they're in these fantastic places. What they're seeing is that, but the reality is that there's rubbish on the ground and the waves are not that great and it's a dark day and there's a dog pooping in the background, right? So they just don't see the reality. They see the filtered version. Now, we're all guilty of this, including myself. So a couple of years ago, I said to my wife, you know, I think I've fallen foul to social comparison theory. I might need to take this photo down off my social media, because this here, that looks like an idyllic dad. That's me and my little girl when she was very young. I look perfect, right? Wrong. The reason I'm sitting on that block is because she had a full-blown meltdown in the cafe because I wouldn't let her put chili flakes on her eggs. But anyone who sees that on my social media thinks I'm a perfect father. So I actually took that down from social media because I felt like I wasn't really being true to social comparison theory. All right. Should all screens be banned? You know, the short answer is no. There are benefits to it. But what you need to keep in mind, and I've just highlighted this study here, because this is a recent study that came out and it's from the Oxford Institute, right? That would appear to be a very reputable place. But what you need to understand is that when the media get hold of these stories and when parents come in and have tried to do some research, or when they've heard someone online talking about how, you know, there's no impact on anyone, on kids, there's no potential risks like this abstract says, and we found no evidence for, you know, any link between gameplay and well-being. you know, like anything, and you guys are health and medical practitioners, we need to look at this with a lens that we've been trained to look at it. And when you read this study, there's a couple of really key points here. The first one is the subjects in this study are not kids. The youngest in there is 16, okay? The second part is the data from this study came from the gaming industry. So, you know, again, to me, that seems like that would be a bit of a conflict of interest if you're getting your data from the gaming industry. Equally so, there are organizations out there that parents seek information out, like this one, and their clinical director is very, you know, research director, sorry, is very loud about shouting down opposite views, and they're very pro gaming. But again, you have to look at the detail. So if we go down this screenshot a little bit, what you'll see if you can notice it. And I spoke to some year 7 and 8s recently, and they got it. So hopefully you very learned people can figure this out too, and why I'd be showing you this. So their sponsors there are the gaming industry. So again, it's not me saying that everything they say should be dismissed, but we should also be very aware of where they're getting their money. Okay. So Wayne and myself, and also Professor Kangas at Macquarie University, published a paper earlier this year, and we looked at the youngest case series of patients in clinical literature that is known to us. So it was 11, 12, and 13-year-olds. To our knowledge, previously in the world literature, the youngest was 15 or 16, I think. So it's only a case series, so it's only a qualitative study, unfortunately, but essentially the model there really that we used, the treatment model, is what I call a parent-child treatment approach. So if we talk about what are the psychological options in treatment that are evidence-based, what we take there is 3 different things. So in the bottom left-hand corner, there is a place for individual therapy, whether that be CBT, motivational interviewing, or interpersonal therapy. I use a combination of them in my clinic, and all our clinicians do. What I will say though is, in my clinical experience, and I'd be keen for Wayne to chip in with, Kim to chip in with his clinical experience too, but essentially, I think it's overplayed. You get a lot of parents saying, you know, you need to fix my child. Individual therapy will work. I get a lot of schools saying, you know, we want you to speak to the kids, and I say, look, I can, but you know, you're going to get sort of more traction if I speak to the parents as well, right? So individual therapy has a role to play in an ideal psychological treatment, but parent-child therapy is very important. So what I include in that is parent education, parent management strategies, but also parent-child therapy together to reduce the conflict in that relationship that usually has, you know, either gotten really bad or just mildly bad. And that is all through a lens of what we call the risk factors and the developmental domains. So the top circle there is a study that Wayne released, and hopefully he'll go through that with you just earlier this year, that talked about 7 common risk factors. And so again, if I won't steal Wayne's thunder here, but if I take one of them, is social isolation. So what we're doing in those bottom 2 circles is working on trying to reverse social isolation. So if you have a child that is socially isolated, how do we work with the parents and the child, or the parent management strategies, or the individual child, if they are amenable, if they're motivated, to work on how to get them connected again through sport, through school, through mates, whatever it may be, right? So this is an overall approach to what you would do, or what I do in a clinic for psychological treatment. And yeah, look, so a few more details there about studies, but I want to touch a bit more on how I've been looking at gaming disorder and internet gaming disorder for the last almost 15 years, and how I encourage parents to look at it, but also for you as clinicians, if you don't want to get the diagnostic criteria out, if you're a GP or a nurse or someone else, and you've got someone there and you've only got 5 minutes with them, you know, you could use a screening tool, and Kim might help us out with that later, but fundamentally, you can just look at them from a developmental perspective, yeah? So how are they going emotionally, socially, behaviorally, and educationally? Now, obviously, general health is not a traditional developmental domain, but the reason I put that in there is because I mean things like sleep, exercise, hygiene, all these other lovely things, appetite, eating. So effectively, what I'm saying is if you have a year 8 boy, for example, because that tends to be a bit of a point in our research where things ramp up, year 7, year 8, year 9, especially boys. So for gaming, if you have a young man, a year 8 boy who, let's take the education one, who doesn't like homework, you ask yourself, compared to other year 8 boys, is that developmentally normal? Yeah. Not many year 8 boys like doing homework. I mean, I don't think I would have liked that either, right? Especially maths. But if you have a year 8 boy that hasn't handed in any assignments or has started skipping school to game or hasn't been to school in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, Kim and I see kids like this every day, unfortunately. That is out of the norm. That is further apart. Similarly, for the behavioral development, is there a scenario where that year 8 boy is going to say thanks very much to mum and dad for taking my phone or for turning off the internet? No. They're probably going to, under their breath, get pretty upset about that. But what's important here for you to screen and to be looking for is it escalating further than that? Is it turning into a full-blown half-an-hour meltdown of, obscenities being screamed and upsetting the whole family? Or the step up from that would be a young man who starts breaking stuff, property destruction, punching holes in walls, this sort of stuff. Or up from that is unfortunately family violence. And it's really unfortunate, and it's only the 1 to 3% that are in that clinical category. But again, that's not a small number, where we see from time to time ABOs being taken out, police being called. So only last month, I was at a police station in Sydney because the commander asked me to come down there and speak to the police because they just don't know what to do when walking. They don't get any training in this. They don't know how to help when walking into a family violence situation because of screens. So I won't go through all of them, but look, one that I really want to point out here in the health area, because this is probably the one that you can do the quick little screening question on, is to ask about exercise and sleep. If you have a young person that is not getting a base level of 8 hours sleep, or staying up later on screens and gaming, or getting up in the middle of the night, or waking up early, for primary school age kids, they started doing this. They know mum and dad will be sound asleep, so wake up and grab the iPad. Or if they've dropped out of sport altogether, no exercise, they used to be a really good soccer player and now they're not playing. All those are really big warning signs as well. And those are questions that are not gaming or screens related. So they're pretty easy to ask, because you can just sort of say, what are you playing? Are you playing anything this winter season? How's your sleep going? So they won't even really know that you're assessing their screens and their gaming. Okay, so I'm going to take you through the 7 steps that I recommend to parents in how to manage this stuff at home. And I could have just jumped straight to this, but unfortunately, and I often want parents to hear the background as well. If I just say this off the bat, then it doesn't make as much sense for parents. So they need a bit of context. But for you as clinicians, what we should understand here is that this is only one element, and in fact, I'll be doing a clinical trial next year, one of the first clinical trials in Australia. In fact, Wayne's got another one, so he'll tell you more about it, but where it'll be based on these parenting strategies. So again, just to emphasize here, this is not everything I do in a clinical setting, but this is just the parent management strategies. So step 1 that I ask parents to do is to take control of the Wi-Fi. And the reason for that is, as I pointed out to you in that Katziari study, when you remove the Wi-Fi, you actually do a big portion of the job. And so when you take the Wi-Fi away, it can, the dopamine is reduced. And there are tech solutions that parents can implement that make this easier. And I want to explain this a little bit here. So what I've got at the top here, there are 3 layers to this to visualize. So at the bottom level are games and applications. And for any of you that have kids at home, you'll know there are many different TV streaming, YouTube, gaming, messenger apps, social media. And then the next level, you've got devices, personal computers, tablets, smartphones, school devices, the Xbox, an iPhone 6 that's sitting in the bottom of a drawer that you didn't even know was there and your child got it out. So what parents quite often get advised to do is to use software controls or to take a device. So many experts say, just man up, just parent and just take a device. In my experience, that's probably the least helpful thing you can do, to say to a parent, just take a device. It's not that easy. You can do that for a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old. But when you get to older years in primary and certainly in high school, that can be really tricky, especially for 10% of people that have subclinical symptoms. Again, that is hundreds of thousands of kids in Australia. So what I'm saying here is, on that top level, there are 2 ways that you get Wi-Fi to enable these devices. The first is the home Wi-Fi, and the second is mobile data. So when you advise a parent to manage the home Wi-Fi, but not manage individual devices or individual apps, they think I'm a bit crazy. So I say to parents, if you have a child that's still giving you their phone or their Xbox or whatever it is, then take it. That's no problem. But really, your insurance policy and the best thing to do is to manage the top level. So you can do that through mesh router systems as well, but there's no foolproof way. Step 2, and the reason for this is, physically taking a device from a child is really hard. And in fact, it gets very heated. And so, let me just go back there. And I won't go through the whole psychological underpinnings of this, but essentially, there is some research out of Sydney University, a guy named Professor Mark Dadds, who, for children with impulse control difficulties, behavioral difficulties, he found that the best parenting model was what he calls low attention, low emotion, right? And what we found in Wayne's research after the fact, and also in my clinical work, is that is actually a pretty decent way to go about it. Low attention, low emotion. But if you physically try and wrestle a device off a child, it's super high attention, high emotion. And so managing the Wi-Fi is the lowest attention and emotion that we can offer. So don't get into guerrilla warfare for parents. If they want to give you their device, do it, but just expect you can have a parent that comes into your clinic and says, no, Jimmy has to put his phone on charge in the kitchen. That's my personal favorite one. And Kim and I speak to kids all the time, and Wayne does too. Oh, your phone's on charge out there? Nah, what are you talking about? I put a packet of cards in there, and I put the case out there, and mum and dad think that's out there. And I have a bit of a laugh and I say, how long have you been doing that for? Oh, like 6 months. It took them forever to figure it out, right? So it turns into what I call guerrilla warfare, because kids are just sort of, doing all this stuff that parents can't keep up with. So step 3 is to negotiate a schedule. There are a lot of people that believe, a lot of psychologists and medical practitioners that believe that gaming can be treated through a lens of what they call self-determination theory. Anyway, I won't go into that, but essentially having a lot more onus over what happens. And I don't disagree, but I don't entirely agree either. I think in my experience, there are some kids that want to do that and help be part of the solution with parents or with someone like me, but there are equally some kids who will not come to the party and who refuse. I've had kids spend upwards of 10 sessions in my office not saying a single word, but just smiling at me. So essentially negotiating a schedule, I've got a big whiteboard in my office, and I'm not expecting that everyone listening tonight has enough time to do this, but I encourage parents to do this at home as well on a scrap piece of paper. What you're doing is you're whittling down the time in that middle area where the Wi-Fi can be on. Because remember, we're doing internet on, internet off stuff. So you see there, if you say to a young person, I'll quite often say, how much time do you want? Oh, unlimited. Because my mate down the road gets unlimited. Okay, but you know your parents are not going to do that. How much time? I want 7 hours. So you sit there and you go, okay, but you get home from school at 5:30, right? Yeah. You got to go to bed at 9:30 to get 8 hours sleep, and they usually vaguely agree they should get 8 hours sleep, even if they're not doing that. Yeah. Where are you going to put the 7 hours? So it's a process of elimination here. And for this next step, essentially, I'm recommending for parents in parent management that we don't get into this nitty gritty of arguing about what is schoolwork and what is recreational. You can't win that, especially for that 1 to 3%. They will constantly be telling you that they have more work to do. So I had a young bloke in the clinic who was in, I think, year 8 or year 9, and he said to his parents in the winter holidays, "I've got a German assignment. I need more time. I need more time." His parents kept kept letting him have more time to do this German assignment. And I said, geez, this is really strange. I've never heard of a year 8 German teacher giving this much work. I said to the parents in session, maybe you should just ask the German teacher. Why don't you just send her an email and ask how much time? And of course, you can sit there and think, what do you think the German teacher said? The answer was, what German assignment? So, that young man had really run rings around his parents here, and he must have got an extra 40 or 50 hours during the holidays to do this assignment, all because his parents didn't want him to fail or his marks to go down. So this step is about talking to parents about, it's a total Wi-Fi amount. And typically what happens when you deal with Wi-Fi this way and screens this way is their marks will go down in the short term because they will miss deadlines, but they have to figure it out over time. So there can be rules attached to that as well. If there are parents or if you're in clinic and you've noticed that they're not going to sport or there's aggression or any of these things, we do take away time. If they have 2 hours, you take away 30 minutes at a time, or 20 to 25%. That's just the behaviorist in me coming out. But one thing that I do guarantee, and this took me years to figure out, is a maximum of 24 hours or 48. And this is super important. Quite often in the child and family dynamic, what you find is that the relationship is so fractured. And the parents have quite often been saying, you've lost it for a week and you've lost it for a month. And then they can't follow through with that anyway, right? But it just raises this huge tension in these families. So for parents, if I say to them, the carrot here for the child has to be 24-hour max. Even if he or she stuffs up, 24-hour max penalty. That's what is trying to get the young person in there as well. So the schedule for this young person looks like between 7 and 9 o'clock. They end up, and again, this is all written on a whiteboard. And I know families don't work this way with perfect times. All that really happens is the parents leave my clinic knowing that they're going to turn the Wi-Fi on for all of that person's devices between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, end of story. Now note, they can do homework at other times if it's offline. I've got no problem with them doing a Word document or PowerPoint or anything else, but it's got to be offline. Okay. So some of you at home would be sitting there thinking, well, kids will just switch then to mobile data, right? Yeah, they will. And so part of this is parents usually try to mess around with screen time or any of these apps. And of course, they're porous. It's very easy to get around screen time. You can change the world clock. You can use a VPN. It's kind of laughably easy, right? Or kids can just break into their parents' account. So typically, if you have a child that's in that clinical category, then you're really talking to the parents about, okay, look, we need them to have some amount of data because we still want them to socialize, right? But 2 to 5 gigabytes, thereabouts, maybe 6 or 7 these days because apps take up a bit more, but you want a limited amount and no family sharing, no automated top up. Optus recently came out with this, plan where parents can pause their kids' data for an hour and a half, which is helpful. I really wish that they would actually take it a step further and allow parents, especially in extreme examples of kids school refusing or family violence, to be able to pause data for 24, 48 hours or something like that. But anyway, I've been told by people in the tech industry, obviously I'm asking too much because that breaks their financial model. Telcos are in the business of selling data these days. So the way that you do that is is through some of these, plans like a MASIM and all that sort of stuff, the cheap $10 plans. The problem is even they keep moving around on parents. I've had parents say, Christmas comes around and a MASIM says you get an extra 20 gigabytes, Merry Christmas, and it's just a nightmare for parents. Lock it in. So the last step is, and you've probably already figured this out, if you pull out as a clinician or advise parents to one of these family tech contracts, in my experience, a lot of the time, kids will run for the hills. You have lost them. So we try to encourage parents or even clinicians to do this in an organic way. Try to use it as like a brainstorming session where they don't feel like they're being, a contract's being put in front of them, okay? It's just not going to go down well for most teenagers. All right, and that's for me. That's it from me, and I think I've done so well. I'm 3 minutes to spare here. So I'll stop sharing my screen and...
You have done fantastically. Thank you so much for our first presentation this evening. We will now hear from Professor Wayne Warburton, who is the Associate Professor of Developmental Psychology, sorry, getting tongue-tied there, at Macquarie University, and is also a registered psychologist. He's a strong research interest in the field of aggressive behavior, media psychology, and clinical programs for screen disorders. I am now going to hand it over to Wayne. Thank you so much.
Great. Let me just bring up my screen.
There we are.
And hopefully everyone can see that. Can you see that?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. All right, great. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Wayne Warburton, and I'm going to take a little bit of a deep dive, as Brad said, into gaming disorders in the brain, and I'll probably flesh out some of the things that Brad talked about before as well, because a lot of the things he talked about, what's really happening is something is happening in the brain that's underneath it. But before we get too much into that, I think it's just important to be on the same page about the developing brain, and to have some sort of sense of why these different things are important and what's going on. So I'm going to start off by just talking a bit about crucial periods of brain development. Then I'm going to talk about persuasive design and neuroscience in the brain, and the way in which both technology and social media and gaming platforms are designed not only to keep you at the screen, but basically to keep the reward systems that underlie addiction kicking in. And then I'm going to talk about screen disorders in the brain. I'm going to talk about, in particular, the functional and structural changes. There are quite a lot of studies now, more than 200, all suggesting that, particularly in that 3% of people who have quite a severe disorder, you see definite changes in both the structure of the brain and its function. Parts of those relate to executive function, emotion regulation, and impulse control, and we'll talk a little bit about those. And one of the things that people don't talk about much, but which I think is really important, is that what we see with a lot of kids with screen problems is quite elevated aggressive behavior. And when you look at the neuroscience of it, about what's happening in the brain, that kind of makes sense. And then the last thing I'm going to do is to talk about risk and resilience approaches to screen disorders. I'll look at some of my own research in this area and what that says, the implications for the way that we might want to approach things clinically. So let's start by looking at the developing brain. Now, when I first studied psychology, I was told that the human brain is set in concrete by about the age of 30. You get every single neuron you're ever going to have when you're born. You don't want to do too many things that are going to kill those brain cells, because you're never going to get them back. And once those patterns are set, the brain doesn't change very much, and it's very, very difficult to change anything about people, because the brain is essentially set like jelly or set like concrete. We don't think that anymore. I mean, in the time that I've been studying psychology, the way we look at the human brain has changed absolutely completely. And now we talk about the exact opposite. We talk about neuroplasticity, and we talk about the brain that wires up every second of every day in response to what we experience. Now that's kind of important. And that's important because when it comes to media, the kids that we see in our practices, their brains are wiring up for a lot of seconds in a day. So back in 2015, the average teenager was spending close to 6 hours and 40 minutes a day for recreational screen use. And I remember when that report came out thinking, well, it can't get more than that, right? I mean, it's more than kids do in a day. It's more than they spend in front of teachers. It's more time than they spend with parents. And it's almost as much time as they spend sleeping, right? This is crazy. It can't go up. But in 2018, when the next report came out, it had gone up to 7 hours and 20 minutes a day. And I really thought that that was just an impossible ceiling that was never going to be surpassed. But then COVID hit, and in the most recent study, which was just a year ago, we found that the average American teenager was spending 8 hours and 39 minutes a day with recreational screen use. Now, that is just an insane amount. And for every one of those 8 hours and 39 minutes, that brain is wiring up in response to what's happening. Now, the way that I think about the brain is that it's the absolutely ultimate use it or lose it organ. So when you're using it, and using it for things like abstract thought, complex problem solving, things that take a lot of cognitive effort, then the brain is growing and it's healthy and well. But if you're doing things that really don't challenge the brain, that don't get those parts of the brain in the frontal lobes that do all of that heavy thinking and heavy lifting, if you're not exercising those, then you really do get atrophy, and you actually see that the brain starts to lose grey matter, it starts to lose some of its connectivity, and you start to see a decrease in synaptic connections and so on. So you have a brain that's shrinking rather than growing and wiring up. And that means that if that's 8 hours and 39 minutes are recreational media that really aren't challenging the brain at all, then you're going to see a brain that's really, for quite a big part of that child's day, wiring up in response to not very much at all. So that makes what kids do with their time and what they do with media quite important. Now, in terms of neural development, there are two really crucial times, and you probably know this, but I think it's just really important to go through it again. So you would already know that early childhood is really important, and this is a very famous set of cells, and of course it's no easy to guess that the first one is from a newborn child. Those are the cells at birth. At 3 months, you can see that the cells are starting to send out dendrites and make synaptic connections, and that brain is starting the process of wiring up. At 6 months, you can see quite a substantial amount of growth and a lot of connections. And then by the time that child is 2 years old, that same group of cells have made a very large amount of synaptic connections. The brain is a lot more dense, and the brain is using quite a lot of glucose. And we know now that at the age of 3, the child has probably 3 times the amount of synaptic connections an adult has, and that their brain burns, maybe 2 to 3 times as much glucose as the adult brain. So, this thing that happens with infants, where they wire up every single thing that happens to them in case it's important, means that their brain becomes very overburdened with connections, quite inefficient, uses a lot of energy that that they won't need to do later on in life. And so at some point in life, we know that brain has to kind of thin down and become more efficient, or it's never going to continue on a good trajectory that way. The other thing about the brain is it develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside out. So, and you're all aware of this, but, the hindbrain, the brain stem, keeps the heart beating and the lungs working, doesn't trouble the keeper too much. and we don't think about it, and I'm certainly not going to bother talking to you too much about it today. Above that is the limbic system of the brain, and the most important thing, and the middle of the brain. And the most important thing about the middle of the brain is that everything that happens there happens outside of conscious awareness. And I think that's really important because, for example, the amygdala is in the middle of the brain, and we don't have any conscious control over the amygdala. We feel those feelings, and we don't really have any control over whether we feel them. Now, as you get older and you start to develop connections between the amygdala and the frontal lobes of the brain, you start to develop the capacity to work out what you're going to do with the emotions, but we don't have conscious control over feeling them. So that's really important. The hippocampus is in the middle of the brain. It's where we lay down memories. We don't have conscious control over that as well. And some of the other systems like fight or flight and so on. Now, that part of the brain, which is very linked to the reward systems and very linked to motivations, and is part of the accelerator, part of the brain that kind of motivates us to do things, that's fully formed by the age of 3. And then after the age of 3 begins this slow period of development where the child's cortex begins to grow. And that's a very slow development. And, you know, I was speaking to one of my colleagues who does neurodevelopment imaging at Indiana University. He said that in his laboratory, there wasn't full brain maturation in the people that they were having in their lab for women between about 26 and 28, and for men up to about the age of 34 was when they were seeing full brain maturity. And so you see a brain that's very, very different. The accelerator, the part that kind of we have no control over and it drives behavior is developed fairly early in life, but the brake, the part of the brain where we have those higher functions, where we think through consequences, control our impulses, plan for the future, have attention and focus, where we manage our emotions, that part of the brain is very slow growing, and it's not really fully developed, you know, well into the adult years, which has a lot of implications, particularly if you're a teenager, you know, when the accelerator's, you know, working overtime and the brake is still under construction. And I remember seeing some really cool slides of 2 people processing emotions, and you know, one of the people processing emotions was a teenager, and all of the activity was in the middle of the brain. But an adult feeling the same emotion, you could see that there was activity in the middle of the brain, but there's also a lot of activity in the front of the brain, where once they had the feeling, they were working out, what am I going to do with it? I'm feeling sad. So how am I going to manage my sadness? I'm going to do something to cheer myself up. Am I going to go and talk with somebody or whatever? And those sorts of things kick in. Now, I think one of the sad things about neuroplasticity is that it doesn't fix everything. And these are 2 images. One is from a normal child, and one is from a child that's brain is very different. In fact, that child is a Romanian orphan. These are also pretty famous images. And what you see is that Romanian orphan is missing almost their entire temporal lobe of the brain. It's just not there. And also limited frontal cortex development and so on. So these key parts of the brain that are very important for human behavior are missing, simply because those kids were put into orphanages and got very, very little stimulation, and they didn't get the sort of environment that the brain needs to grow properly, and no amount of neuroplasticity is going to help that. So those Romanian orphans, of course, you know, as adults have all sorts of problems with behavioral control and behavioral management and attention and focus and memory and all of those higher functions, because their brain never really fully developed in the first instance. And I think one of the important things for us to remember, and this is a little bit of an aside, but we know that when the brain is developing, when kids are small, the brain really only has 2 speeds. The first speed is everything is normal and I'm going to grow normally. But, you know, the second speed is something is wrong and I'm going to stop growing. And we see, you know, kids who have some sort of trauma, and it doesn't have to be abuse, it could be neglect, but it can also be that they're sick, or someone in a house goes away, or something else happens to them that, you know, tells their brain that something is wrong. You know, the neurons stop migrating and some of the cells start and connections start to die, and the brain floods with things that it doesn't want, and, you know, it stops growing. And of course, given that that middle part of the brain is fully developed by the age of 3, the sorts of parts of the brain that stop growing are most likely to be that cortex, those parts of the brain where we have all of those higher functions that are slow to develop and kick in later in life. And what that means is lots of people have difficulties with impulse control and difficulties with the executive function, a lot of the time because they've had adverse experiences in their early life that have meant that their brain hasn't really developed very well. Okay. People talk a lot about the importance of the early years in brain development, but I reckon a really crucial time is during adolescence. And adolescence is a time when 2 really important things happen. The first one is what we call myelinization. That's essentially those long, thin neurons getting a kind of a fatty sheath, the white matter. And what that does is it provides this non-conductive coating. So all electrical wires have a plastic coating on them. If they don't, the wires short circuit and the electricity goes everywhere and everything's a big mess. Well, with the brain, it works a whole lot better if all of the neurons are insulated and they do what they're meant to do, just like an electrical cable is meant to do, and it makes them a far more effective and makes processing faster. The second thing is that during those adolescent years, children lose their, or teenagers lose about 60 to 70% of their neural connections. So remember earlier on, you know, that 3-year-old, 3 times as many neural connections as an adult. Well, these are lost in the teenage years. And what happens is that the things that aren't used just get reabsorbed, and the things that are being used, they start to wire in perhaps a bit more strongly, and those are the connections that are kept. Now, at the last paper that I read, it suggested that this process of taking away the connections that you don't need and having more efficient processing and using less glucose and the myelinization of the neurons means that the fully developed brain is probably about 3,000 times more efficient than the brain of a newborn child, because all of those things make a massive difference to how the brain functions. So, you know, adolescents are clearly capable of doing a whole lot of things that younger kids can do simply because their brains are just so much more efficient. Now, Jay Geed is one of my heroes. I have some scientific heroes. Brad knows some of them. One of mine is Jay Geed, who was the chief of brain imaging at NIM in the US, and he spoke a lot about the findings as they emerged on brain development in teenagers and in children. And one of the things that Jay Geed said is if an adolescent is doing music or sports or academics, those are the connections that are going to be hardwired. If they're lying on the couch or playing video games or watching TV, MTV, those are the cells and connections that are going to survive. And Barbara Strauch, who wrote a book about this about the same time that Jay Geed was reporting his findings, said, look, adolescence may actually be one of the worst times to expose a brain to drugs and alcohol or even a steady dose of violent video games, because adolescence is a fairly vulnerable time. Okay, so that's brain development. And this design of the brain is something that is used by the people who develop apps and develop web-based platforms. And I just want to run through some of the things that they do. So Fortnite, who is a game that you probably have all heard of, and Brad talked a little bit about it earlier. It's a free game, but that $160 billion in revenue back in 2020, Fortnite made $5 billion of that, right? But the game is free. So how do they make $5 billion from a game that doesn't cost you any money to play? Well, they do it with 2 things, and those 2 things are advertising and in-app purchases. And the business model for all games that are online, and for all social media and all free platforms that we use online, we're not going to charge you, but we want you to be watching our advertisements, and we're getting paid for those, and we want you to buy things from us, and we're going to keep on reminding you about the things that are for sale. And in order for that to happen, you need people at the screen. Now, the problem is that if your competitor, if the game that you're competing against or the social media platform that you're competing against is able to get people at the screen at addiction levels, then that's the baseline for you. Otherwise, you're not in business. And I know that Brad said earlier that people are reluctant to talk about addiction, and so that we're going to today talk about disorder. But in the industry, in the persuasive design industry, in the design of the tech and in the design of the products, the word addiction is the one that's used. And I'm just going to show you. This is a screenshot I took from a place called Boundless Mind. It used to be called Dopamine Labs. And here's what Dalton Coombs was saying: we're releasing an artificial intelligence tool designed to get users hooked on returning to your app. Right? He's not talking about keeping it at the screen. He's talking about getting people hooked. That is the business model. So if you want people to become addicted to your product, to use it, to keep them not at the screen, but to keep them compulsively at the screen, what do you do? Well, the first thing you do is you use a whole bunch of existing design techniques that are really quite well known. Gambling has paved the way for many decades now on how to keep people at screens and how to keep addicts at screens. And we know a whole lot of things that you can build into the design of games and online platforms and technology that are going to keep people there. Then once you've done that, you then use persuasive design experts and you co-opt neuroscientists and neuroscience to make the screen tech even more addictive. And so one of the places that used to do this, for example, was Dopamine Labs, who then changed their name to Boundless Mind for PR reasons. And what they do is they just say, we're going to use our neuroscientists to test your product and work out what it's doing in the brains of people, and we're going to tweak it so that it works most in a way to keep people at the screen and to co-opt those reward systems in the sorts of ways that the reward systems work when people are addicted. And then here's the kicker. Here's the really big thing. You then get an artificial intelligence to monitor every user in real time, to profile their personality and to profile their use patterns, and then to target their advertising and to customize the user experience to keep them at the screen. So for example, if the AI decides that your attention seems to be waning, you might get a pop-up. Or if it thinks that you're feeling a bit lonely, it might pop up an ad for eharmony.com or whatever. But every single user having a bespoke experience that's created by an artificial intelligence based on the vulnerabilities that it's sensing in the person is the last piece of the puzzle in how to keep people at the screen. And hopefully, if you're from industry, at this kind of addiction level. Now, Brad talked a bit about dopamine before, and I just want to talk about it in a little bit more detail because I think it's really important. I mean, dopamine is a neurochemical that's linked to the reward centers of the brain, and in particular the nucleus accumbens, where we experience feelings of pleasure, and in one of its pathways. And one of the things that dopamine does is that it signals to us that something good is coming and we should keep seeking it. So it motivates our behavior. And this is kind of really important, right? It's really important in evolutionary terms, and it's really important in terms of survival, because you need some kind of system to push people ahead to make sure that they're reproducing and eating and doing all of the things that you need to do to survive. And so we have this kind of reward system in the brain that allows this, and dopamine is this key part of it. Now, what happens is that if you think something cool and good that you need is coming, then the brain releases dopamine to say, hey, something nice is coming, and you need to do this thing more to seek the reward. And you have this kind of urgency, and the dopamine kind of pushes it. Now, you release more dopamine if a reward is coming, but you don't know when it's coming. Because then the dopamine says, it might be now, it might be now, it might be now. You've just got to keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. We don't know when the reward's coming, but if you just keep doing this behavior, then the reward's going to come eventually. And it keeps on releasing and pushing this behavior where you're seeking that thing. Now, for other things, the system has a brake as well. So the dopamine is part of the accelerator. But there's also a break. So if you think about sex, for example, dopamine is released in anticipation of sex and during sex because you know something really cool is coming. But at some point, you have a climax, and then the break kicks in. Right? And when the break kicks in, what happens is that GABA is released, and that dries up the dopamine, and that stops you seeking that thing. And then the brain starts to flood more with serotonin, and it replaces that kind of sense of urgency with a sense of contentment and relaxation and happiness, and a sense that everything's nice. And I just want to kind of sit back and enjoy it. Okay. And if you remember that Zeigarnik effect, that Brad talked about, I mean, that's part of the dopamine system, right? I mean, nature has given us an accelerator and a brake so that you don't, for example, have sex to the point of death, right? You get to a point of satisfaction, then the brake kicks in and it stops the behavior, and you feel satisfied and you stop. But the Zeigarnik effect is essentially the persuasive design elements keeping the accelerator going but disabling the brake, never allowing you to get a sense of satisfaction or completion or closure. It keeps you thinking something better is coming, something better is coming, something better is coming. So part of this persuasive design element is to keep people anticipating a reward, but never letting them feel satisfied and contented. And then you end up with that constant compulsion to check your email, your social media, your text messages, your likes, to play the video game, and so on. Okay, here are some design features that make video game addictive. First is the random reward schedules, reward loops, and other things that facilitate dopamine release and engage the brain reward systems and keep the accelerator on. And then the second thing are these design features that give an impression of an impending conclusion, the fun failure that Brad talked about, but the game running nearly indefinitely, no break or reward system, right? The design features stop the break from kicking in. Then there's a constant barrage of banners and prompts and demands and cues and triggers, and they keep drawing your attention back to the screen. As Brad also talked about, they need to be easy to use, so there's low cognitive effort, and effort usually translates to achievement. So if life isn't great outside of the screen, then on the screen, life can feel pretty good because it's pretty easy to be successful. They target your vulnerabilities by meeting basic needs, but those needs, of course, vanish when the screen is turned off. So it's meeting your needs when you're there, but as soon as you turn the screen off, then you're not feeling great anymore, and you're going to feel that compulsion to return. Games don't reward short or unscheduled periods of play, and you can't save between levels, so you need to either go on to the next level or you're going to lose your progress. There are other design features that slow down play and that they force you to play longer. And of course, there's immersion. Brad talked about that too. What do you not find in any casinos? You don't find windows, and you don't find television screens with the AFL match playing on them, right? What you don't want people is to be aware of anything except what they're doing right in the moment. And video games and these platforms are the same. They want you to be immersed and want you to lose awareness of the external surroundings and become part of what's happening online. And the last thing is, if you can get people to make in-app purchases, and they also feel invested, and that's going to keep people at the screen as well because they've invested in it and they feel like they should keep playing. So what does all this mean for the brain? Well, going back to this early idea that the brain is the ultimate use it or lose it organ, then if you're spending 8 or 10 or 12 hours a day doing something that doesn't really challenge your brain very much, and where there's not a lot of activity in the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobes where these higher functions are, then that's going to show changes, and fairly quickly. Typically in maybe 6 weeks to 3 months, you're going to see changes. So here are some of the structural and functional changes that we see. So in that 3% with a severe screen problem, we certainly see changes in that important part of the brain in the prefrontal cortex and in frontal lobes, where you think through consequences, where you control your impulses, where you plan for the future, solve problems, focus and attend, manage emotions, and so on. The first thing that you see is atrophy of grey matter. And so you see atrophy in the frontal lobe, where we have those executive functions. You see atrophy in the striatum, which is a big part of the reward system, but it's also a part of the brain that's involved in suppressing antisocial impulses. People with problems with the striatum tend to be more antisocial and more aggressive. And you see atrophy in the insula, a part of the brain that's linked to the development of empathy. People whose insula doesn't work very well often find it difficult to have deep or high quality relationships, and there are also links between poor insular functioning and violent behaviour. So those are three important parts of the brain where you see atrophy. You also see thinning of the cerebral cortex, and we think that impacts some of the higher functions. So you also see impairment on cognitive tasks, less efficient information processing, and reduced impulse control because of that. And then there are the things related to emotion regulation and behavioural inhibition. So one of the reasons that you're going to see problems with frontal lobe deficits, you have often with somebody who is a gamer, who has an internet gaming disorder or a gaming disorder, you have this kind of triple whammy. The first thing is that we know is that a lot of people who play a lot of games are playing games that are violent, and we know from a number of brain imaging studies that when people are playing violent games or watching violent media, there's reduced activity in the frontal lobes of the brain. And then we have what we've just talked about, which is people who have these kind of addiction level use are starting to get atrophy, a loss of grey matter, cortical thinning, reduced connectivity, which also reduces the ability to for those higher functions in the front of the brain. And then we know that the brain has lower frontal lobe activity anyway during recreational screen use, the sort of screen use where, you know, to give an example, you know, you might be reeling endlessly through Instagram or TikTok clips, and you might talk to a kid who's been doing for 2 hours and then just say, you know, can you tell me what you've been doing? And they could barely tell you anything because nothing has gone in. You know, their brain has really been on pause. So those deficits have big impacts on emotion regulation, behavioral control, and cognitive function and thinking through consequences. Now, one of the things that we also see are compromised white matter integrity. The white matter is the myelin, that myelin sheath, and it's to do with neuron efficiency. And if there's compromised white matter, then there can be poor communication between brain centers. And just to give you one example, for example, if you know there's poorer communication between the amygdala where you feel emotions and the frontal lobes of the brain where you work out what you're going to do with them, then you're going to have troubles with emotion regulation, for example. The next thing is that you see changes to the dopamine and reward system that are very similar to what you see in people who are addicted to drugs and have other addictions. And we've talked about the accelerator going on the brake being disabled, but you know, this recruitment of the dopamine reward system in a particular way and this constant disabling of the brake seems to have an impact on some kids. Now, one of the things that you would possibly hear from people who say there's no such thing as a screen addiction and you know we shouldn't talk about it in the same way we talk about drugs, and the reason we can't is that if you know take ice, for example, you know it can increase dopamine levels up to 1400%. Well, you know, behavioral addictions, you know, like you know gaming disorder, we know that they can only increase dopamine within what is the brain's normal upper range, and the brain can maybe increase its dopamine levels, you know, during periods of excitement, maybe 50%, 100%, maybe up to 200%, but nowhere near those kind of huge levels you get with drugs. And so they say, well, how can you compare it? Well, you know, I say that's the wrong question, right? I mean, the real question is how much is enough? And what we know from gambling disorder, and I've worked with a lot of problem gamblers, and I've worked with people addicted to drugs, and I can tell you that the people who have a gambling problem have as much of a problem with the drugs, if not more. It's just absolutely insane because increases of 50 to 100% are enough to cause someone to be addicted to something. Emotion dysregulation, there are a whole bunch of studies now showing clear links between people having difficulties with problematic gaming and emotion dysregulation. And we know that kids who are impulsive are more prone to addictive disorders, and that also plays a role as well. In terms of executive function and attention deficits, you definitely see that there are links between a lot of time on screens and with people who have problems with screens and a loss of executive function and attention deficits. And this is also shown in studies. Now, I just want to talk about a meta-analysis that we're about to have published. So we've looked at the 41 published studies that look at the effect of any type of screen disorder on cognitive function. And by far the biggest effect was on attention and focus, and then the second biggest effect was on these executive functions. So, you know, one of the important things that we found was that there wasn't any study that found that spending a lot of time on screens was either beneficial or neutral for cognitive function. In every area of cognitive function, there was a deficit. It's just that the deficit was greater for attention and focus, and the deficit was greater for executive function. But it definitely has a deleterious effect across all of the studies that we saw. And the last one is empathy deficits. I won't talk a lot about this in detail, but what we see is that people who spend a lot of time on screens, a decrease in empathy, and we think that's that, you know, during internet use, for example, you see almost no activation in sorts of parts of the brain that you expect to be activated during empathy, and we think that it probably is in some way leading to some sort of compromise in empathic ability. And lastly, aggressive behavior. I mean, a lot of aggressive behavior is about impulse control. So if you have frontal lobes that are turned off or that are in atrophy, then you're not going to have very good impulse control. You're not going to think through the consequences of behavior. You're not going to have very good self-control, and you're not going to plan very well for the future. So, you know, all of these things can lead to more aggressive behavior. And, you know, you can clearly see why kids who have these things happening in their brain because of their screen use, why they might also be more aggressive. And we really do see them as a lot more aggressive. You know, in that series of case studies that Brad was talking about, you know, there was nothing special about the cases, but one of the things that really struck me was that, you know, in 5 of the 6 cases, there was substantial physical aggression by the kids. And in half of those cases, those kids had an AVO taken out against them by their parents because they were so aggressive when the parents tried to take the games away. And, you know, increased aggression in internet gaming disorder and in gaming disorder are really well documented now. It's something that nobody talked about 2 or 3 years ago, but I think it's pretty well established these days. So the last thing I want to talk about in my last few minutes is some stuff around risk and resilience. So here's a shameless plug for my model of screen addiction, which is what I tend to test in my research. But what my research tends to support is the idea that the kids who are most at risk for having a problem with screen addiction are kids who have 2 basic things. The first thing is that they don't have great executive function in the first place. So they're more impulsive, low self-control, not very good at regulating their emotions in the first instance. And the second thing is that they tend to not have their basic needs met in the offline world. So they're often socially isolated. They often don't have much control over their lives in their outside world. They often have quite low self-esteem, and they're often not good at very many things. The third thing we find is that a lot of kids who develop a problem with screen addiction have a less than optimal home environment. So the sorts of things that we found that are linked are poor parent-child relationship, insecure attachment, low warmth in the family. Parents aren't particularly competent, not good at setting boundaries, and not very good at supervising. But when we put all these things in the statistical analysis, when we put everything together, that kind of usually gets partialed out statistically, because what's really happening is that less than optimal home environment is what's feeding these 2 basic things. You know, the child's needs are not being met in the home, and the home isn't helping them manage them to develop good executive function. And that's kind of one of the, you know, what's happening behind the scenes in terms of them having the risks. And of course, genes and environment kick in as well. So in our recent study that Brad alluded to, we looked at about 1,000 teenagers in year 7 to 10 in high school. And what we wanted to find out was what were the biggest risk factors for having some sort of internet gaming disorder. And the biggest risk factors were low self-control, being socially isolated and not having much control over the world around you. In other words, a combination of not very good executive function and some of these key needs not being met. And the protective factors were pretty much the opposite, although there are other things like, being female, I was more protective than being male and so on. But, the kids who had the least problem had good self-control, they were socially included, the high perceived control of the environment, they had secure attachment with their parents, good self-esteem, they were able to do more things. Now, that's not what real people look like, right? Real people, have a mixture of risk and protective factors. And so one of the things we're really interested in was, well, as the risk factors accumulate, does the risk of having a problem also accumulate with it? Is there a kind of a linear relationship? And there was. With every additional risk factor, the risk of having an internet gaming disorder increased, in a linear fashion. And the same was true with protective factors, right? With every additional protective factor, up to about 6, there was this linear decrease in the likelihood of having a problem. But by the time you got to 6, there was this kind of curvilinear function where 6 was enough. Once you had 6 protective factors, 7, 8, 10, 20, 100, none of them added an additional amount of protection. 6 was plenty to just take you to the very lowest level of risk to have a problem. But in the real world, people have some risk factors and some protective factors. So the analysis I was most interested in is this one where we subtracted the protective factors from the risk factors to get a sense of how many net risk factors those teenagers had. And with a score of 0, it means there's an equal amount of risk and protective factors. If there's a positive score, then you've got more risk factors than protective factors. If you've got a negative score, you've got more protective factors. And what we found was, in this sample, if those kids had an average of 5 net more risk factors than protective factors, then that was what would take them across the line to meeting clinical criteria for having a gaming disorder in that sample. So for us, what we think is that those things are very helpful clinically. The first thing is that they can help you to identify the kids who are most at risk, right? I mean, those are the kids with low executive function and needs not met offline, those kids from an unhelpful family environment, or also the kids who are going to struggle to manage their screen use. And the 3 factors that seem most important are low self-control, social isolation, low perceived control over the environment. And if we can identify those factors, in particular as 3 factors early, you might be able to intervene early and stop there being a problem. The second thing is that these screen problems occur on a continuum, and you would have seen Brad's diagram. Most people don't have a problem, then you've got this smaller amount. In Australia, it's about 10% who have a problematic level of use, and then you have this kind of 3% who have this addicted level of use. Every move down the continuum has benefits in terms of reduced harm, and what you want to do is to take somebody down that continuum from being up at that high end where they have a really severe problem, bring them down to where they have less of a problem. And one of the key ways of doing that is to get rid of some of the risk factors or bolster some of the protective factors so that there are less problems that that kid is dealing with that are going to lead to them having a difficulty. Now, I'm not too sure what's happened here, so I'm just going to move the things around on the screen. The last thing is, if you can take one risk factor and turn it around into a protective factor, then the net risk score decreases by 2. And if those in this sample who had internet gaming disorder turned around just 3 risk factors, they would have actually moved into net protection because they would have gone from +5 to -1, okay? Because all they needed was a net score of 5 to be into those criteria. And so if clinically you can help that child to turn around low self-esteem, to feeling this genuine sense of self-worth about their actual offline skills and abilities, then that's going to make a big difference about where you are on the continuum about having a problem. If a child doesn't have much control over the world, but you can help them get this sense of control and autonomy, then that's going to make a big difference to whether they need the screen or not. If you have a child who's socially isolated, then you teach them communication skills and you talk with them about places they can make genuine friendships and stable and inclusive friendships, then that can be turned from a risk factor and protective factor. And if they're not good at many things, and you help them to find things that they're interested in and good at, and they start to build this stable of skills and capacities that are offline, then that's also going to be helpful for them and keep them away from the screen, hopefully. The important thing is that the treatment needs to be strengths-based. You need to build on what the child is good at, and you need to meet that child's needs and work with them so that the screens become less and less relevant to them, and the cool things that are happening in their life become more and more relevant. It's best scaffolded, as Brad will tell you, if the parents and the family buy in, but even practitioners with parents who are not helpful, and that's probably the majority, unfortunately, you can help as well by doing some of the things we've talked about, identifying the risk factors and working with that child towards the sorts of things that are going to help them to be drawn towards the offline world and away from the online world. The last thing I wanted to say is that we have a program called Reset A, and I'm going to give you the web address, which is www.resetaus.com. We're starting that program on the Central Coast in Wyong in mid-October, and we're looking to recruit families where the child has a gaming problem or a gaming disorder. We've been working for 2 years on this program, and we're very, very keen to get kids to come and take part in it, so that we can help them and hopefully find out whether the program is as effective as it has been overseas, where we've run it successfully in another country. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that. I'll now hand over to Dr. Kim Lee, who is an Adelaide-based child and adolescent psychiatrist specializing in video game addiction. Kim provides a complete online telepsychiatric service for via the CGI clinic. This offers gaming disorder assessment and management plans for Australian patients up to 25 years of age. I'll hand it over to you now. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you. What a brilliant presentation it's been so far. I'm very aware that there's 45 people watching, and I really look up to Brad and Wayne. This is cutting edge stuff that you're witnessing today, and I'm really excited to see the Wyong program on the Central Coast get up and running. So my name's Kim. I'm based in Adelaide. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I did my training in Sydney on the North Shore, so that's how I met Brad. And yeah, my passion is gaming disorder, and I see all ages for general psychiatry and gaming disorder, but obviously specialize in the younger age groups. Today, I saw a university student who is doing their masters and talking about how they're struggling with inattention and their history of periods of high video game use. So I'm just going to share. Okay, PowerPoint. There we go. Up and running. So I'm going to be talking about the clinical aspects. I'm going to try and be as engaging as possible, make it as practical as possible. You've got so much information already today. And really my job is to convince to you that this is worthwhile asking about and worthwhile tackling in the clinical setting. I'll refer to a famous psychologist in America who in the 1970s asked the question, what is alcoholism? Or more importantly, what is a mountain? And what they were really trying to describe is this history repeating itself with all kinds of addictions, whether it's alcohol, gambling, video games. We've always asked, where is the line drawn before it becomes a problem? And this particular psychiatrist, George Vaillant, famous for coining the Vaillant mature defense mechanisms, he said, when you look at a mountain, you just know it's a mountain. And it's a common sense, layperson's approach to addiction. And when you see someone with a drinking problem, you know they've got a drinking problem. And when you see a young person or an adult have a video gaming problem, you know it's a video gaming problem. So for all the clinicians out there today, I know you have very busy lives. So what is the one question that you would ask within your consult? You've got 5-10 minutes to ask a question that's easy to remember. Well, that question in my books would be, how many hours a week do you play video games? And the reason for that is it encompasses a few different criteria within gaming disorder. And the way you should ask it is, you should ask them how many hours a week do you play the games, but also how many hours per week night that you play the game, and also how many hours a day do you play on the weekend, and calculate that. And then you cross-reference that with their parents. How many hours a day does your child or your son or your daughter play video games? Because their child might be minimizing how many hours. So the child says 4 hours on a weekday, 10 hours on a Saturday and Sunday. And so you're calculating it's about 40 hours per week. So it's like working a full-time job. And that's the easy way for you to remember that it's like working a full-time job. It's committing yourself to a virtual world. And often, if you're not a pro sports gamer, you're working for peanuts or for free. And when I was a trainee, I received a grant to go to Singapore to work in video gaming addiction clinics. And this was back in 2015. And I helped co-author a commentary to describe the data over 2 years, looking at 120 teenagers who were mostly gaming every day. And their mean gaming time was 45 hours per week. And their most common comorbidities were ADHD and depression. Back then, honestly, daily gaming was not very common. And so what we're seeing today, all kids, majority of kids, playing every day, logging in every day, checking their accounts, doing something small, playing for a few minutes or playing for hours. And if you're a GP and you see someone, or you're a psychologist and you see a client who you think has a gaming disorder and you want an opinion, by all means refer to Brad, but unfortunately his books are closed. You can also refer to myself. This is my website. These are the Argus and HealthLink addresses that you can just send through the referral, and we'll sort it out for you. And so my talk outline is this, looking at the diagnosis in the clinical setting, looking at the comorbidities, looking at screening tools, my treatment approaches, pharmacological therapies, and what the research says about treatment, and then abstinence protocols. And so WHO came out with gaming disorder in 2018, 2019, and I was lucky enough to go to Japan to visit the Kurihama National Addiction Center in 2017. So that was when they were in the proposal stage, and yeah, it was a really great experience. And so you've got, again, 3 main criteria: a loss of control over your gaming time, priority for gaming over other important activities, and continued use despite the negative consequences. And so you see a young person, they say they're playing 40 hours per week. And then that question, I think in general, we'll be covering the second 2 criteria: priority over other activities, continued use despite negative consequences, unless of course, you know, they're not addicted, but they're able to balance the 40 hours or even more sometimes with their personal lives, with a full-time job, whilst studying, whilst being an esports gamer. So it's not diagnostic, the time factor, but it does give you some clues and allows you opportunity to ask some more questions. And so when I attended the International Conference for Behavioral Addictions in Japan, Daniel King, he presented a talk looking at all the screening tools available, looking at internet addiction and gaming disorder, and he identified that the AI CA was the most robust out of all the screening tools. And as you can see, the first couple of questions already there allude to how many hours a day do you spend on the weekday and how many hours a day do you spend on the weekend. There's a total of 15 questions. I personally myself don't routinely send this screening tool to my patients. To be honest, I use the gaming disorder criteria, and if I want to ask around it, then I will. But to satisfy myself clinically, or their GP clinically, or their psychologist clinically, I use the WHO criteria. I find that much more, efficient and can get to the bottom of the problem fairly quickly. But by all means, if you're doing research, you want to send through a questionnaire to a classroom or a school of kids, you could send this particular screening tool to them. Case from Flinders University Hospital in Adelaide. This was a story that was published in the Adelaide Advertiser. It was a case of a 19-year-old who was admitted to the inpatient unit following an attempted suicide attempt, and they realized that this person was addicted to their Xbox, and they had come in with head lice. They hadn't been looking after themselves, and when they were discharged from hospital, they were referred to the statewide gambling service, who offered them follow-up via telehealth as an outpatient. And the young person agreed to everything they said, but never came to any subsequent follow-ups. And what happened was the mother was like, please, you must help me. Let me have his sessions if he's not going to come to those sessions. And so they actually implemented a parent implementation program based on a program for partners living with an alcoholic in the 1990s, and they used a manual to show them some basic principles of how to approach their son. And one of those principles was to positively reinforce the behaviors that you do want. And the interesting part of the story was the mother had actually rewired this teenager's bedroom to turn off the power to the bedroom whenever she wanted, and she was punishing her son if he was gaming too much. What the Flinders gambling team said was, what you should do is every week focus on one behavior you want. For example, the first week might be have a shower and you can have your power back on, and you can game as much as you want, and I'm not allowed to nag you about the gaming. The second week would be have a shower every day and maybe go outside, and you get access to power to your bedroom. And over 5 sessions, over 8 weeks, apparently this young person left home, sold the Xbox, got a job, and moved out of home and lived independently. So those stories also exist. It's almost too good to be true, but they also exist out there. A clinical scenario in the private setting. So obviously I work in the private setting. This is actually a College of Psychiatry practice exam, or no, it was actually an actual exam in 2017, an 8-minute station, observed clinical scenario. GP refers to the psychiatrist mother of a 17-year-old university student who's worried about their son spending too much time playing video games. And when I heard about this station, I said to my trainee psychiatrist, look, let's do this actual station. You pretend to be the actor and play the role playing of the mother, and I'll do it without looking at the answer, the correct answer for this station. And so I attempted it, and I'll just show you some of the questions I asked and how I asked it. Okay.
Time in his room. How many hours a day do you spend in there?
Look, it's really hard to tell, but I think it's sort of around 4 hours sort of every night, and on the weekends it would be up to 8 hours. It's quite a long time. It hasn't always been like this, but it sort of seems to have just gotten a bit out of control.
Okay. And for how long has he been isolating himself for?
It's been I think it's probably gotten worse since he got his own computer, which is in the last sort of year or so. But he's at uni at the moment studying graphic design, so I guess that kind of lends itself a bit to using computers.
Yeah. And how's he doing in terms of his course? Is he passing or?
I don't know. I don't think he's doing very well. He kind of I think he's getting a lot of his coursework sort of done really.
I won't show you the whole video, but you get an idea. Go back to my talk. Okay. So this is a shared clinical scenario that I actually referred to Brad to help me out with. It's actually the son of a medical professional. The teenage son was academically not doing very well, and there was a lot of conflict with their parents. Their son had actually been recruited semi-professionally into an esports career at the age of 15, 16, and hadn't been earning money yet, but the team was very organized and they definitely had career goals and aspirations to make this young person into a lucrative money-earning athlete. There was a family predisposition to developing mental illness, and there was a lot of high expressed emotion. You know, there was a very authoritarian parenting style. Mother would, threaten the young person if they didn't study, then, fine, just game as much as you want, and that would backfire. And it backfired in other ways too, in that they just kept playing video games in their granny flat, and also developed anxiety and compulsive deceit and lying to the point where they also developed the habit of lying to their own teammates within the esports team. Socially well supported by their family and their professional team. And I'll be seeing this young person again to discuss how to cut down and balance their academic life with their esports life. But I've referred the parents to Brad for family sessions, and I twisted his arm and used my working relationship with him to squeeze them into his closed books. So if you have that relationship with Brad, then I'll go ahead and try to twist his arm. Now, in terms of telehealth strategies, I have used a screen share function to engage a young person who refused to talk to me. So that's the benefit of telehealth. I'll get them to log in with their PC and then screen share with me their favorite game, and they will talk about what they're doing, and I'll get them to explain what they're doing. And some of the esports gamers that I'm working with, who are earning tens of thousands of dollars per month at the age of 16, their gaming ability is like Neo in the Matrix. They're just shooting and killing opponents even before the other person knows it's happening. The common factors for failed attempts to cut down or change in behavior is a lack of insights, limited parenting capacity to enforce boundaries, and a lack of therapeutic alliance with the clinician or lack of engagement. Comorbidities, 3 broad theories of gaming disorder: social deficit hypothesis, comorbidity hypothesis, and gaming as a way to self-regulate and escape distressing feelings. ADHD and autism has been linked closely with gaming addiction. It happens more often in boys. With kids on the spectrum, they spend more time playing video games than people with typical development. The online world just makes sense to them. You don't need to read facial expressions. Things are predictable. There's rules that people follow. And if you're on Minecraft, then it's not awkward to start a conversation with others on Minecraft. You just talk about Minecraft. People with autism and ADHD are great at risk of problematic video game use, and inattentive symptoms are strongly associated with problematic gaming for both groups, and role-playing games are an additional risk factor for people on the autism spectrum. And so this is exactly what Wayne's studies are looking at: the executive function, the ADHD, inattention problems are definitely linked with gaming disorder. This is a study from Singapore looking at how ADHD and gaming work in both ways. If you increase your gaming time, you worsen your inattention. There's a dopamine hypothesis that when you're untreated, not getting stimulant treatment for your ADHD, you're self-medicating with video games which give you a flow of rewards constantly. A time displacement hypothesis, if you're not spending time studying or playing sports, then you're losing those skills because you're spending all that time online. Gaming violence is very exciting and it stimulates the visual attention. So it's important to explain to young people that there's two different types of attention. There's the visual attention, looking at a screen, fast moving images, excitement, shooting things. It's great. That's why they can spend a couple of hours playing a video game straight, but only 5 minutes when they're reading a book, something that's boring, something that takes a lot of effort. And that's the second type of attention, which is the attention that we all know that requires a lot of effort and motivation. And also the intensity of video games keep people hooked. This is an interesting case report from Japan. Essentially, 5-year-old kid went to an autism clinic, ticked all the boxes. The researchers thought, there's something not quite right about this child. We suspect that there's something else going on. And sure enough, spending lots of time watching their favorite TV shows, spending 6+ hours on screens. And they said to their parents, look, go back home, take away all the screens, come back in 2 months and we'll retest your child. Sure enough, they didn't meet any of the criteria for autism anymore. And you can see that the drawing in the middle, the first drawing is the child drawing a picture of their mother's face, pre-test and pre-intervention. And then after the intervention, their drawing is completely different. And so they hypothesized that screens were causing an attachment disruption and mimicking autism symptoms. All right, so pulling the plug. This is a video that I spliced together that is looking at the different ways that people in the West and the East approach treatment and rehabilitation. So, play this video. So the first clip is from China.
Security in this center resembles that of a prison. Gates and windows are locked, barbed wire is fixed atop the high walls. People here are not allowed to have mobile devices. But there are no criminals here. This is a treatment center for internet addicts. Former Chinese Army Colonel Cao Ran has been running this facility located south of Beijing for nearly 20 years.
我们大概收治了1万多个孩子，那么他们的平均年龄呢，大概都在17岁左右。
About 100 addicts, mostly teenagers, are currently being treated at the center. They must adhere to rules and take part in military-style drills as part of their rehabilitation. Most of the teens were brought here against their will. The Internet Addiction Center is the last hope for many addicted teens and their parents, who pay a whopping 10,000 yuan, more than $1,400 for each month of treatment here.
收治进来了，我们有一个条件，必须爸爸妈妈其中有一个人要在这个长期的陪伴。我们要改变他的整个家庭系统。另外呢，我们还有这个医学治疗，比如说我们会有一些网瘾的孩子，他有重度抑郁，那我们要请精神科大夫会诊，严重的了呢要吃一些对症治疗的药物。
Restart is the first video game addiction rehab in the United States. It's treated over 275 gaming addicts since it started 9 years ago and currently has a waiting list to get in.
The first phase is this intensive phase where they have no access to digital media.
Okay.
This is a chore chart, and these chores rotate every week.
Hillary Cash founded Restart and is the chief clinical officer of the program.
Yeah, and so these are the bedrooms. This is just one of the guys' bedrooms.
No screens.
No screens.
Phase 1 includes a minimum of an 8-week detox from technology. No phones, no screens, and no contact with the outside world.
Most of them fall between 18 and 30. They come from nice families. They have had many privileges of a middle-class life, usually.
You talk about middle class. How much does Restart cost?
For most people who stay for about 8 weeks here, it costs about $30,000. And
that's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money.
As you can see, they're comparing the different approaches. You've got obviously China, where they've got a massive problem over there, and they're trying to tackle this problem at scale using paramilitary type approaches. And then in the West, you've got rehab centers, which are, marketed towards people of middle class families with money to pay for quite, intensive rehab. Now, in Australia, we actually have, programs, camps that you can send your child to that go through the school holidays for a week, and you can pay, $5,000. That's the early bird special there. And I had my first client who was referred to me by their GP, and their pediatrician had actually recommended this particular Veterans Mentors program to the child. And I had my reservations, and this particular young person, teenager, school refusing, playing their PlayStation, not even doing chores. I worked with them to essentially get them to the camp because they were refusing to attend. Eventually got them there, came back, whole different kid. These programs aren't designed for kids with gaming disorder. It's designed to help kids who are falling off the tracks. But somehow this awakened this young person, and to me, it's kind of like a real coming of age type, moment in their lives, a hero's journey. If you're a fan of, Joseph Campbell and the importance of a hero's journey and leaving the family home and overcoming something that is really difficult. But the young person told me that essentially their approach is people who used to be in the army, yelling at them in their face and intimidating them to submit and to do as they say. And so the therapeutic benefits, the long-lasting therapeutic benefits, you got to be question, how effective this is. And that's why I think it's really important that we do provide funding and opportunities for research programs like Wayne and his team on the Central Coast to provide a better alternative rather than these sort of last resort options. I myself have, as you said, as I said, gone across around the world looking at different treatments, and in Singapore they're way ahead of the game, offering individual group-based treatments, family therapy, routine screening of kids, and screening them within schools and offering intervention programs in the school holidays at school. This is a systematic review of gaming disorder treatments by Daniel King. He looked at 30 different studies. Essentially, what you need to take away from this is that historically, there's a lot of inconsistencies with the definition, diagnosis, the way it was measured, and a lack of randomization and blinding and lack of controls with any kind of video gaming addiction treatment historically. But now with gaming disorder acknowledged as a proper disorder, I think this will lead to better studies and more robust scientific evidence of how effective these treatments are. There is a larger evidence base for CBT, and he commented that there needs to be greater consistency and standardization in these treatments. And so this particular study looked at the spectrum of gaming disorder, comparing 100 gamers seeking treatment to 100 people not seeking treatment. And they categorized them in people who didn't have the disorder, people who met the disorder for DSM-5 IGD only, or having what we call risky or hazardous gaming, which is, I guess, the less pathological, and then the more intense pathological type, where they met both the internet gaming disorder criteria and gaming disorder criteria, and they were more likely to have ADHD as well. This is just a representation looking at the differences between WHO criteria versus the DSM-5 proposed criteria. As you can see, it's 3 versus 9 criteria, but there are some similarities. We'll skip this. So looking at other treatment options, most of the studies come from South Korea, some from China and Europe. They have shown that the main components of effective treatments looking at therapy is modifying maladaptive beliefs relating to their gaming behavior and helping them to cope with withdrawals and other unpleasant states when they're not gaming. And the aim of all these therapies is to help the young person regain control of their life with or without controlled gaming. This is a CBT session outline from South Korea, looking at various strategies over 8 sessions. I won't go through that right now. And then Brad Marshall and Wayne Warburton and Professor Kangas published their case series and, for our benefit, highlighted exactly what themes they would use within the clinical setting and of different approaches. And of course, Brad's book, Tech Diet for Your Child and Teen, is a great book, very readable, and I would recommend that to any parent. Looking at family therapy, South Koreans did an intervention over 3 weeks involving the whole family, and they essentially gave the families a prescription to do an hourly activity 4 times a week together as a family. They scanned the young person's brain in an MRI machine, and they showed them pictures of families and video games to see which parts of the brain lit up, whether there was a relational center in the brain, an affection center lit up with pictures of the families, or excitement when showing a picture of a video game. The families visited the clinics on 7 occasions, and they did sessions as a family, such as sports or doing lessons, cooking together. 3 families actually watched Korean dramas together, but I don't know whether you would watch Squid Game with your child. Probably not the most appropriate Korean drama. But the main emphasis is doing something as a family together to work on that bond, that connection with your child. And they found that the families, the intervention, it helped light up that relational affection area of their child's brain and improve their relationship and reduce their overall gaming time at follow-up, and it led to more cohesion. And so that's a strategy you can prescribe to families. Go and do something fun for an hour 4 times a week. Pharmacological therapies, the strongest case is for stimulants, looking at treating the ADHD and also medications that reduce cravings. So this is a Korean study again, looking at kids who were treated with ADHD with Ritalin, and they found that their mean gaming time reduced over time with the medication. This is a study looking at a anti-craving agent, bupropion or Zyban, and comparing that to a common antidepressant versus placebo. And they found that both the antidepressant and the anti-craving agent improved the clinical symptoms. And their hypothesis was that the bupropion was addressing some of the maladaptive behaviors within video gaming addiction. It reduced the direct symptoms associated with gaming. It improved activities of daily living. It reduced impulsivity, reduced inattention, and improved their mood. And the hypothesis, the mechanism within the brain is the noradrenergic action of bupropion reducing impulsivity, and the dopaminergic action reducing the urge and replacing the pleasurable effects of playing video games. You might know bupropion as Zyban, which was marketed as an anti-craving agent for people who are addicted to cigarette smoking and nicotine. I've just got a few minutes here just to look at abstinence protocols. I myself have gone through various dumb phone challenges for a month. It's very excruciating. Daniel King and University of Adelaide and Flinders University did a 84-hour brief abstinence protocol, told their research subjects to not game from Friday midday to Monday midday. They essentially changed their passwords. They didn't have access over the weekend. And this helped address the negative cognitions of gaming, some of those negative thoughts that go in through a young person's mind. I need to game so my teammates can get help from me, or there's nothing else better to do, and I need to game in order to feel better about myself. There are self-help groups such as the Game Quitters 90-Day Detox. Daniel King and the founder of Game Quitters found that people who were depressed had more intense symptoms and stronger negative beliefs about their gaming. And Game Quitters offers a free forum where you can pretty much get help from other people in the same situation in an Alcoholics Anonymous AA style environment. And you can read other people's entries. They journal every day. And if I see a game that I have never heard of before, I'll just go on the forum and I'll type in that game as a keyword to search on how other people have struggled to quit that game. I won't go through this video, but essentially China now have restricted video game access to children to only 1 hour on a Friday night, Saturday night and Sunday night, so 3 hours per week restriction. So again, very paternalistic, at scale, and restricting access to kids. In terms of key principles for engaging kids, in my practice, I'll often see their parents separately first, because often if the parents are talking about the problem in front of the child, they're berating their child and it shames the child, and the child won't engage with me afterwards. I'll use similar questions to Brad, asking them about their favorite game to engage them, and then also ask them how they get their enjoyment from the game. Why is this game so much fun? Is it the social aspects? Is it the achievement aspects? Is it the domination aspects? And some strategies when working with a young person: if there's a parental guideline, use it. Look at the Australian classification system, put the game in the search box and see what it comes up with. Is it violent? Is it restricted to adults? Is there sexual themes? Is there gambling themes? Looking at the child as from a psychosocial approach, so making sure you do ask about their habits online. Telling parents no devices in the bedroom. The Singaporeans found that kids who had TVs and video game consoles in their bedrooms were more likely to be addicted. And then also abstinence, cutting down, not gaming, having a day off per week without gaming, and of course, filling in that time, scheduling other activities for that young person. So my final words: if you have a spare moment, ask about gaming. The best evidence is for CBT. There's some evidence for stimulants and anti-craving. I limit myself to adults for the anti-craving agents. I haven't started a young person with anti-craving agents yet, but if they've got all the hallmarks of depression or ADHD, of course, I'll treat that. And then finally, watch my SBS documentary on demand. We filmed this during the pandemic. It's called Are You Addicted to Technology? And it was released last year. Unfortunately, you can only watch it on an Apple product, so that's the irony of that. But very interesting for kids. There's a online school section on the SBS website, and I'll just quickly show you one last take-home message.
But until big tech make that change, it's really up to you to take charge. Remember, you are in control. You have the power. After all, you can always switch off.
That's me. Thank you so much for having me. What a marathon webinar that was, and thank you for sticking with us.
Thank you so much, Doctor. Oh, I'm sure everybody's thoroughly enjoyed that part of the presentation as well. We have come to this part of our webinar where we will have some questions. I do see that there is one in the chat box at the moment, and it is from Kelly. Kelly asks, how do we manage the fact that adults are likely to want to use Wi-Fi during the times that we've suggested have shut-off times? So that's going to be a Brad question. So I'll put it to you, Brad.
Yeah, thanks very much. Kelly, so there are certain routers that you can use that really assist with this. So one of them is called the TP-Link Deco M5. I have no affiliation with TP-Link. In fact, I tried to email them and they weren't interested. So essentially what it allows you to do is have different profiles. And so you can have parents that still have access and kids that don't. So it does get around that. Look, I also should say though, it's not a perfect solution. Ironically, Apple in the last couple of months with their phones have made inbuilt MAC IP address spoofing. Anyway, I don't want to bore people at home, but it does make things a lot more difficult because every time the tech companies change this stuff, it does change what we recommend as well. And so that makes the router system management even more complicated. But to answer your question, the Deco M5 or any mesh router system allows you to sort of have the parents turned on, but the kids turned off.
Excellent. There weren't any other questions.
On that, I actually had a family this week who I followed up. I said, Brad recommended this Wi-Fi router. Is it working? They went and got it, and it's actually working. Their teenage son is actually cutting down and asking their mother, can I have a little bit extra time, and coming up to them rather than having this battle. So the Deco M5 is a real hit.
Yeah, I've seen it clinically, I've seen it work for about 90% of kids, and keeping in mind, obviously, the clinical cases that we see, Kim and I, are the more extreme ones, but I have seen 1 or 2 kids find their way around that, but you've got to be pretty exceptional to get around that.
Excellent. We have had another question come through from Shane. Shane says, for very resistant children/adolescents, do you focus the shift to just working with the parents entirely, or do you still attempt to gain some traction with the client? If you do, what is your approach?
Kim, do you want to give that one a crack first, and I'll go second?
Yeah. Look, I can't recall the last time I only worked with the parents. But obviously, if the child refuses to get out of the car or refuses to be on the screen, then you got to try and do what you can. You got to try and find a little wedge, a little window where you go, okay, so dad is a gamer, the mum's a gamer. Actually, there was one session that I really did work with the parents, and that was one of the most heartfelt sessions I ever had to do. The mother was so burnt out. Both parents were gamers themselves, and I asked the child who was on the spectrum, the parents were actually quite strict on their access to the games, and I said, when you're not allowed to game, do your parents game in front of you? And they're like, yep. And I was like, well, okay, we need to do something about this, work with the parents. Look, you can't just say, don't game on these days, but then game in front of your child. You're just rubbing it in their face. The mother just said to me, look, if my child takes their own life, that's a solution. And this is the only time in my life where I've ever heard a mother say that. And all the alarm bells are ringing, all the red flags are ringing, and I knew I had to put the oxygen mask on that mother's face to work with the mother first before I work with that child.
Yeah, so to Shane's question, I think I work more with, I'm more willing to work just with parents than maybe a lot of other people are. Typically, if I get a young person that is super resistant, as Kim mentioned, I'll try and find a wedge. I will persist with them. Even, I mentioned before in my talk, I've had a young man sit in my clinic and say nothing for the better part of 6 months and just smile at me. And there's a lot of silence. and I'll just keep persisting with asking about games or weather or anything that there is. And he did actually start talking to me. But to answer your question, Shane, in those scenarios, I won't do a full session of just sitting there and doing that. It'll be a short period of that of trying to engage, and I'll continue with the parent management strategies that I've talked about. So if you have a young person that just absolutely will not engage, or they have just no insight, I keep chipping away at trying to help them with motivational interviewing, trying to help them with insight. But failing that, I persist with parent management strategies and putting boundaries around that stuff. Typically, putting the boundaries around it with the parents, ironically, actually shifts them to a point where they do have to come to the party. And what I mean by that is quite often it'll come out in anger, because they'll see me as the guy, the evil guy that did that, which is kind of true, I guess. But that's good. I mean, if they come in and they yell at me or they get angry at me, at least I can work with that. I can do something with that. So yeah. Wayne, do you have any thoughts on that question, or are you?
I mean, I think it's so crucial to look at what needs the screen is meeting for the child. And you know, when you know what role the screen plays in a child's life, it makes it so much easier to work with the child and with the parents about, you know, finding ways to meet those needs in the offline world and making the screen have less pull for that child. And then in terms of things like executive function, you know, I think you can work with parents and kids about ways to, you know, strengthen your ability to manage your behavior and so on. So, you know, I mean, I think there are some key things, but, you know, a really important one is just working with the strengths of that child, because, you know, essentially all you can do is build on what they're good at and what their strengths are. If you take this kind of deficit approach, you're never going to get anywhere, I don't reckon.
Excellent. We have 3 more questions, and any other questions that do come through, we can put through and I can send through to the panel to be answered offline, and I can email out. The next question is from Helen, and it is it a good idea to encourage parents to monitor their child's screen time from an early age and also have time when the whole family switches off, example, meal times?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think it's just a yes. And I'll just add in there, meal times are a real, and again, it might be me sort of having an old school of my father implementing this, but it's such a crucial time. You know, I tell this story about 18 months ago. I was at SeaWorld, and I was gobsmacked that I was seeing 2-year-olds, 4-year-olds walking through an amusement park with an iPad. If you can't be entertained in an amusement park, I don't know what to say. So I think that at a core, though, for Helen, yes, you know, meal times and things like that certainly should be screen-free times.
Kim touched on this too. Like, kids are watching their parents, and there's been a lot of research on this in the last 2 or 3 years. You know, when a parent says to their kids, you need to be spending less time on your screen, that child is looking right back at you and saying, well, why are you, you know, checking your Instagram account at the dinner table, or well, why is dad always checking his emails when he's talking to me and I only get half of his attention, or whatever? You know, I mean, there has to be a whole family solution with the same rules that apply to everybody, so that the parents are modeling the sort of screen use that they want for their kids that they think is healthy. It's just also healthy for them.
Excellent. Well, the next question that we have is from Courtney, and it is, have you ever come across recommending removing access to Wi-Fi as a restrictive practice, mostly in an NDIS context? I've been trying to work out how to recommend things like this without it being seen as an environmental restraint.
Kim?
Yeah, I guess in our job, it's the art of sales and selling a message and having that sense of authority. And having watched this webinar, you now got these pearls of wisdom. You know, you're now more confident to sell this idea, and you know, sell them the idea that it's how important real life connections are. And look, I guess in an NDIS point of view, it's tricky. I speak to a lot of people who tell me they can't find a good caseworker, they can't find good support workers. Their support workers are often on their phone with their child. There was a mother from Cairns who reached out to both myself and Brad, and they're coming up with NDIS service provision where people are aware of gaming as a tool to engage a young person and to engage someone on the spectrum, and but to play the games with that child. So there's different approaches, but you know, if you think limiting the Wi-Fi or getting rid of it for a certain period of time, go for it. I often quote the Daniel King 84-hour study and say, this is a period of time where you're giving your brain a rest. You're playing every day, and that's not normal.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that, especially in the NDIS scenario, without knowing the specifics for who she's referring to, but even for, you know, people on with high needs on NDIS, it's still very rare that you're going to get a scenario where, you know, they should just have 100% access to screens. I think that most of the time you've still got to get that balance. There's still got to be some socialization and other stuff there, even if it is a, you know, and I get this quite often whenever I'm speaking, or if I post some information, I get parents that quite often get very angry and say, well, you know, you shouldn't judge me, for example, for having my child on a phone at dinner, because how do you know that child doesn't have a disability, or they haven't just left a domestic violence situation or something like that. I mean, there are exceptions to every rule, right? Even my daughter had an obscene amount of screens one day when she had to go to hospital for awful reasons, right? I mean, there are exceptions to every rule from what we talk about here. So for the workers at home and the health workers and the medical professionals, you know, use your common sense with what we said to you tonight.
Excellent. And the last question is, how do we refer to the clinic at Wyong?
And this is a really good point, because Wayne, can I jump in here? You didn't actually tell the people of the Central Coast, who is a lot of people here, that it's free. So that you missed the main part is that for families, it's free.
It's a free, it's a free program. You go to www.resataus, that's resataus.com. And if you go to that website, it tells you all about the program. It tells you how to apply. There's an email address there you can send to. You can email me. I'm really happy to talk to anybody about the program. So if you talk to me, go to the website, go to admin@resataus.com. You can send us an email, but we'd love to get some referrals.
What I will do after this as well is I will send out a link to everybody here this evening as well, with that link, so that everybody has access and can jump on and have a bit of a look. Other than that brings us to an end. Thank you so much to our panel for coming along this evening, and thank you so much to our participants for coming along with some really great questions. As I mentioned before, we will have this echo session coming up. I've sent you all some emails with sending invitations to that, and that will be a live and interactive session. Following this, there will be a quick survey. If you could please fill it out, that would be fantastic. But other than that, thank you so much for coming along, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.